They're going to kill us. They're going to take our jobs. They are an abomination. Those fears could apply to robots, but it could also be mutants. So we decided to talk about both, a look at two real-life game changers with two of the best from each field. Ahead on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovetz. Two of the most dependable, guaranteed to terrify inciting incidents in modern movies is the coming robot invasion and the spawn of genetic mutations gone awry. We fear them separately for the same reasons. But in real life, it's the overlap of these sciences that could be a big game changer. So let's talk mutants and robots. Dr. Chris Mason is here in the flesh. He is an associate professor of computational genomics at Weill Cornell Medical Center. Plastered on the screens and beaming in from the West Coast is Daniel H. Wilson, the New York Times bestselling author of The Clockwork Dynasty and Robopocalypse. He's also a robotics engineer. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How do you feel being so big, Daniel?
Yeah, I can see myself looming over you. I kind of like it. Mm.
Nearly all fictional robots are evil, and in fiction, most intentionally altered genetic humans, well, they make us a little uncomfortable. Daniel, what do you think? Robotics or genetics will save mankind from all our errors?
You know, I don't think it's either or. I think that both of those things are going to be happening at the same time. I know that most people, if they've got medical issues or severe disability, they would prefer that the geneticist cure them rather than, for instance, have their limbs amputated and replaced with prosthetics, or have their natural functioning replaced with robotics. So hopefully robots can stand in until the geneticists get everything fixed up.
Well, and there are some good cases where robots really are key to medicine. So some of the best advances in surgery and surgical techniques are the robotic surgery, where you put in two small incisions and you can replace whole parts of your heart and then have it come back out, and then you'll have only two small, very tiny incisions, so you can leave the hospital after a couple days after having pieces of your heart replaced, whereas it used to be you'd be in the hospital for a month and just in recovery. So there's already some natural alliances that have formed.
So these things that we're fearing for the same reason are actually the things that will save us.
And sometimes very much keep you alive, or and can give you new abilities. I think it's, if you're repairing something, I think no one has qualms with that. It's when suddenly the robots or the genes do something totally new and is really surprising is when people get uncomfortable, as you said.
Well, let's get to that concept of change.
As it turns out, most of the scientists are not actually diabolical, even if they're studying robotics or genetics.
They go to
There's
different
very
conferences.
little hand waving.
They're in one conference, and then there's a lot when you used to get your badge at a conference. It's evil or good. And you pick one.
That would really clarify things if they would do it that way. Yeah, just
Right.
color-code it.
Yeah.
Our guest, Daniel H. Wilson, built real-life robots at Carnegie Mellon, and now he's focused his genius on fictional robots, which puts him at the remarkable intersection of understanding real facts, creative fictions, and how to scare the heck out of us. In Daniel's novel, The Clockwork Dynasty, sentient robots were created hundreds of years ago. But Daniel, in real life, as a scientist, how far do you think we are from the technology required to create the kind of sentient, emotional robots we see in your work?
Well, I think sentience and emotion are two different things. They may even be mutually exclusive. We love to project our feelings to every inanimate object that we interact with, from a car to a toaster or whatever. Just try not to curse out your Alexa if you can. That may come back to bite you. In terms of sentience, though, that's a much harder problem. So a general human level type of intelligence, I think that's much further off. But I do have hope. In the Clockwork Dynasty, it talks about all of these robots that were built a long time ago, and it's really true. If you go and look at the history of humanity, basically all of recorded history, you'll find examples of people trying to build robots. They're trying to build simulacrum of life, and that seems to me to be a really basic human desire that has been around for a really long time, and I doubt that it'll ever go away until maybe we finally create a sentient robot and come to regret it or rejoice.
As a layperson, whenever I see a robot that has eyebrows, I always think that this is some human's desire to make that machine feel emotional.
Well, yeah, I mean, so this is the promise of a humanoid robot, is that it's going to interact with us the way that we interact with each other. So those eyebrows are super useful. If it did not have eyebrows, I think you might find it pretty weird and distracting to try to interact with it. And in fact, there's a lot of research just now where they're realizing that choosing like the color of the robot's case, people ascribe racial feelings to that. So they really are going to interact with us in a human domain, whether the roboticists want them to or not. So what color you make your robot, how you make it act, how you make it look, all of those things really matter a lot. And I don't think there's no such thing as sort of a useless decision, because that's all going to contribute to the sphere of communication that you're establishing with a user.
On the genetic side, in movies like Splice or Mimic, creatures with DNA enhancements are sinister and deadly. And in real life, Dr. He-Jian Ku's experiments on embryos, which were then implanted into women, reads almost exactly like the plot of Orphan Black. Chris, can we already do much of what we see in movies but just don't? And if we did, are we going to get Splice or are we going to get X-Men? Please say X-Men.
We can get some X-Men in some circumstances, not quite as much with flame throwing, but certainly some of the features are I actually teach all the first-year medical students. I have a whole section about what are the known instances where a certain gene or a certain mutation can give you the equivalent of a superpower. Wherein you cannot get a disease, even if the disease is trying to get you, or essentially what Dr. He tried to do is actually put a deleted gene into the embryos so that they would be born without the ability to get HIV. So his goal, while done without the proper guidelines or ethical approval or foresight or community engagement, which is probably something you should do if you're engineering humans and then having them be implanted into women to give birth to. The goal was to make it so you could have a child born that would be basically built-in superpower to be resistant to HIV. So you could, if you did that for everyone, HIV would disappear from the earth. And so, so that's kind of the good side, is you can start to think about resistance to disease, or the ability to heal faster can be changed, or the ability to live longer. We can't quite control magnetism, or we can't quite, again, flame throwing is going to be harder. Give us some more time. There's some people working on that, but you need propellant. You're going to need a lot of ways to light the fire. So that's farther off. But the ability to resist disease or even prevent disease, or if you have a genetic defect, to go into individual cells, reprogram it, and then take away something that's giving you a disease is already reality, both at the genetic level and also what's called the epigenetic level, where you can actually change not just whether a gene is there, but actually what it's doing. And this is being done for beta thalassemia right now. So there's really hundreds of millions of dollars of research just in the last year being poured into this idea of modifying cells called somatic cells just on your body that you're not going to pass on to the next generation, but you can modify them today.
That you're not going to pass on.
Right. So somatic therapy is often one thing that also people generally are okay with, because you can get a tattoo and that's not going to go onto your kids, or you can cut your hair, that clearly doesn't get passed on. Somatic therapy is like that on your cells. It's something, if you changed your body today, it stays just with you, and I think most people view that as, especially if it's for medical purposes, fine. It's when you change the germline, or what goes to the next generation, or you make whole embryos from scratch and you've changed their genome, that's something that has been discussed for decades, but it's no longer science fiction. It's happened. There's embryos that have been engineered, implanted, and now born, and we don't know the full impact of what's going to happen to those embryos.
Well, so why, Dr. He was vilified, he was fired by his university, and I believe yesterday or the day before, the Times announced that they had made a great advance in sickle cell disease by messing with the genome. Why is one lauded and the other morally suspect?
So some of it does break down in terms of somatic versus germline. So did you change just something for you that won't get passed on, or did you change something that will go on forever? And this has been historically a pretty clear dividing line, is that you say, well, if it's just you and it's just therapy, that's okay. But where people get uncomfortable is, well, are you doing enhancement? Are you giving yourself new abilities? Then that begins to get people often uncomfortable. And then also, if you completely change the human race, you'd alter the DNA that's being passed on to the next generation, people get uncomfortable with that. But in both cases, I'd say these are things that we are already doing. It's just suddenly it's much more precise. And so we already know we're impacting our evolution and directing our own evolution to some degree. But it's just suddenly much more precise.
Do you think that's an issue of consent?
Yeah, so the next generation cannot consent. Of course, you can't ask them. If you're an embryo, they're much too small to ask questions. But
They just don't talk to, the kids don't talk to you like they should.
It's a one-way conversation. But they, and they're very tired. They're growing all the time. So I think there is a question of what you can consent to, but we do many things already on behalf of the next generation to ostensibly make their lives better. In terms of, for public health instances, putting chloride in the public water supply, thinking about how we manage food supplies. And so
we vaccinate kids before they can object to it. And they object to it when you do it.
Actually, the first time I felt some real horror was when I watched my daughter get her first shot. And I know that vaccines are an extraordinary public health need, but just seeing the needle was, seeing her cry was, one of the first times of having a sense of, oh, this is terrifying to watch your daughter get a shot. So, but we do that because we know that even if something hurts in the short term, it will benefit not only that person, but the whole species in the long term. So, and we don't ask for consent because we know it's in the public good. So if at some point the genetic engineering is perceived and validated, and we think it is for the benefit of humankind, I think it'll probably be okay.
Do you have an opinion on Dr. He?
Yeah, so I think his goal was laudable. He thought, well, how can we figure out a way to have couples who might have an HIV positive father guarantee that their child won't suffer the same disease? So that's a great goal. We should figure out ways to prevent disease, make it so people don't have to pass on disease, sure. But the problem is the hubris behind engineering one gene negates the knowledge of everything we know about everything else in the human DNA and human genome. So the gene he chose was called CCR5, and he wanted to make this deletion that puts a receptor on your cells so that the virus can't get in. So that sounds pretty good. Let's prevent viruses from getting in my cells. Great, except that it makes it harder for HIV, or impossible. It makes it more likely that West Nile virus can give you an infection. So like many things in our DNA and in all of ecology and biology, there's something called balancing selection, where if you change one thing, it might be counteracting something else. So there's multiple forces at play on every gene in our body. And so the problem is that I think while the goal is laudable, the implementation of it was in the dark. The technical aspects of it don't look that good from what we've seen. And also he did it without, this has been a decades-long conversation, or centuries and even millennia if you go back far enough to Aristotle and De Anima, right? Because it's an old question. Should we and how do we engineer humans is really old, and he didn't do it in a public and transparent way.
He's a classic movie science villain in a certain way.
He kind of is a little bit, yeah, that's right, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And but he looks kind of frail.
He does.
He needs to be like bulkier and have he should have like little robots behind him actually that were drooling with the polymerases or something coming out, yeah. But
that would definitely make it a better visual because you felt for him when you saw him.
He's looked very sympathetic, yeah.
On the robot side, the fine-tuning of decision-making plays a big role in our fears also. In the backstory of the 2004 movie I, Robot, we learn that Will Smith's character hates robots because a robot made an ethical choice he did not agree with. The robot saved Smith instead of a drowning child, and many humans would calculate the choice differently, but the robot made its decision by the numbers, by the math. And in real life, the capacity of a machine to understand human moral choices is a huge concern to the people who worry about this sort of thing. And it's a huge subject. But since Daniel is both a wordsmith and a scientist, I wanted to talk specifically about the issue of language, because machine language is all math and electricity. Daniel, as a writer, you understand the importance of words, and as a scientist, you know the importance of math. So do you think that we have enough shared language with machines to really explain the concepts of human morality to a robot?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not going to be a situation where you sit down and morally reason out, how your autonomous car should behave if there's an accident. But I think that roboticists absolutely have the tools to govern the behavior of their creations out there in the wild. I mean, there's always issues. Human beings have the same issues. Sensor error, maybe the robot didn't notice that it was a little kid, or maybe the robot wasn't sure, or, there's always going to be mitigating factors when you're out in the real world. By the way, it also bears mentioning that iRobot was not based on Asimov's stories. It was just the studio got a hold of the rights to that and then assigned the title to an unrelated screenplay that they had, which has always bothered me. So
now
Will
you can
Smith
tell the
is
world.
for Isaac Asimov in that one. But yeah, so the real question, and I think this is actually really awesome, is do we have the language to communicate with ourselves what our moral values are? And so we usually, we have some basic moral precepts. There's some things that we all agree on. We have laws, we have basic ethics, but then when it comes down to the nitty gritty, human beings typically figure this stuff out in courts of law, in front of a jury of their peers. But now that we are starting to get autonomous tools, that are operating in our societies, and they're going to have to make moral decisions, and they're going to operate in an ethical space. Well, now it's up to us to talk to each other and to figure out and to actually lay out, what we really believe. And a lot of this comes out in the form of these thought experiments, which are really interesting, to consider. So you've got autonomous vehicles are a great example, of a near-term need for us to lay out our feelings and morals. So if you've got a thought experiment where, it's going to run over Will Smith, or it's going to run over a kid and it can't stop and it's got to make a decision, how do we as a society sort that out? I mean, should it be able to kill its occupant, in order to save other people? Well, is anyone going to buy that car? If they know that as soon as there's some trouble, it's going to just kill you because there's only one person in the car, but there's 10 people outside. So in terms of robots as consumer products, robots as moral agents, in our society, this isn't up to the robots, and it's not going to happen with conversations with the robots. It's going to happen with conversations between people, and it'll be dictated to the robots. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that the robots themselves have the ability to be paragons of morality because they don't make the same selfish decisions that people might. And a robot could actually, in the world, act as a paragon, as the perfect example of morality in action, and even be something that people might look up to or trust more than they would ever trust a human being, for instance. So yeah, I think this is going to be really fascinating to watch this new dimension unfold in our environment. As we start seeing little robots walking around delivering packages, big robots driving down the street, robots flying over our heads. At all times they're going to be operating in this moral sphere.
Well, so that's actually, let's address this as people. Are we ready as people, as humans, to define what is a specific hard edge level of morality? What is the sphere of morality that we're going to discuss? Daniel, I'm thinking about that scene from your book that I actually was telling Chris about, where the remaining humans are on the mesa, and somebody from a different Native American tribe is an outlier. And we have to address that. You have to address in the book this whole question of the out group, which is a basic, old, non-technological moral issue. As we move into these complex moral decisions in genetics and in robotics, are we ready as a people?
I think even today there's stratification in societies, and that has happened throughout every human society where there's unequal distribution of resources and wealth, and it's not fair today. And so a big concern on the genetic side is that if you make these superhumans, they'll have, it'll only go to the rich, and it'll create maybe different strata of society. To which I can say that's already the case now. And so the hope is that if we're aware of it, you could actually prevent that from happening by ensuring equal distribution of some of the technologies to be applied to fix people. But that doesn't happen today, and we know that inequality has existed, for almost as long as humans have. So, but the ability to recognize it and quantify it and measure it and start to say, how do we, at least with legislation, address it if it doesn't happen naturally? is one of the, I think, more optimistic parts of humanity, is that we can at least recognize our own faults and try to fix them. And maybe the robots will be, if we design them very correctly, maybe they will be really the avatars of moral hope.
Well, Chris, so I wrote a novel called Amped, which was about the advent of a lot of these like brain-computer interfaces and some medical technology that was robotic that people were getting. And what I realized thinking about that a lot is that it's, with the advent of some of this new technology, it's not really a Tony Stark scenario where it goes to some rich guy. It's really a scenario where someone has a very serious problem and they're willing to have a hole drilled in their head, in order to alleviate this problem. And I found that sometimes the latest technology goes to sort of the vulnerable people, the people who are willing to take risks, in order to solve very serious problems. So I don't know how that plays out over the long term. Eventually people with wealth are probably just getting this stuff for fun, like getting brain implants like you'd get your ears pierced at the mall or something. But, in the short term, I do think that there is some hope, right? Because it does tend to go to the people who need it most, because they're willing to take the biggest risk.
Yeah, even in immuno-oncology, like a lot of you take cells out of the body, re-engineer the T cells, and so they can actually retarget specific components of the cancer cells. The therapy is $250,000, but it is by people who are in their it's their last stand against cancer, and it's going towards people that'll do anything to live. And so it's hopeful in the sense that you can do that therapeutically if you have cancer. But there are people, I just got back from a trip 2 days ago, where there's people doing stem cell therapies on themselves, or taking out their natural killer cells from their body, growing them up so they can then put them infused back in their body to kind of scavenge the body and clean it out again. And I just...
Those are the guys with the mad scientist badge.
They have pretty much a badge. And they said, what did you do this weekend? Well, I took a bunch of cells out of my body, reprogrammed them, and grew them up, and then put them back in on Monday. And then one of the guys I met just 2 days ago, he said, well, you wouldn't believe the things that came out of my body after I did that. I said, you're right, I probably wouldn't, and I'm glad I'm not looking at your phone right now. So, but he's a fairly wealthy individual, and he's thinking about ways, well, how do I kill all my old dead cells that have not been cleaned out in my body? How do I reprogram my stem cells? And so I mean, but this is an old feature of society, where there's, rich and poor, and sometimes even really awful things, like with the Tuskegee experiments, where the poor and disadvantaged would be abused by the medical system. And so again, I think the awareness of these historical injustices and the awareness of disparities will make it so maybe we can correct them and have it be accessible.
Right, and I think a lot of the role of the movie in that is to rehearse the concepts.
What ifs,
what ifs. We talk a lot about the hardware that needs to be bigger and the processors that need to get faster. But what about us? Will we have to change? Do you guys think we're going to have to improve our capacity for mathematics and understanding before we can share our lives with machines or with the next genetic iteration?
I think certainly more computational capacity and speed and breadth is always better. And this moment that's been long fantasized about is called the Singularity, where you can upload your brain and have it live forever. We don't have a good construct for how to really model an entire human brain in a computer yet. And this is something that some people think will happen by the 2030s, which I think is optimistic. But to do that, you would need far more of an infrastructure and computational breadth and depth to describe an entire personality than we have today. But I think that's one place where they'll merge. If you can really take an entire person's brain and faithfully replicate it into a robot, you basically succeeded in making a complete AI platform that is kind of like the Singularity.
Yeah, but that would change the brain. Don't you think the human would change if it was in a robot, Daniel?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, your embodiment dictates so much. And there are some people who sort of believe that this mind uploading scenario is a way to live forever, to which, I have to mention your body is a big pile of dead flesh somewhere still. It's not a way to live forever. It's a way to create a very realistic simulation of a person's personality. But I would say in general, if you're talking about real near-term robotics, it is a human party, okay? And the robots are just invited, and they can stay as long as they have human manners. So the modern endeavor of building advanced robotics is actually all about making it so that they can do the things that we do completely naturally. So, early on in the 60s when AI was first starting, people were able to create competitive chess playing machines, and they thought, wow, this whole thing is going to go by quick. We're going to be able to create humanoid robots that in no time.
Yes.
And basically, it's a fundamental kind of mistake in that we have evolved for a long time to be able to interact with each other, to do speech recognition, gesture recognition, to guess at another person's internal state, mainly because if you're not able to do that, you've probably got clubbed over a head with a rock at some point and failed to procreate, right? So these characteristics allow us to function as a society, and we have so much machinery that helps us do this, so much that it makes the process invisible to us, and we think that it's super easy, when in fact these are some of the most challenging problems for roboticists to solve. So giving the robots the ability to determine how we're feeling, to recognize our speech, to talk back, to model other people's states, internal states. I mean, that stuff is really hard, and that is exactly what we're trying to do. So they're coming toward us. It's not about us going toward them, at least not yet. That would be a much, much, much farther in the future.
This conversation on robotics and genetics exploded and exceeded our time, so we're going to cut it into 2 shows. Please join us next time for our conversation with Chris Mason and Daniel H. Wilson about the overlap of genetics and robotics.